at 6:20.
Yeah, okay. It's a one-eye farm.
Yeah.
My son's.
Well, good morning. My name is Mike McGinnis. I'm the markets editor for Successful Farming and agriculture.com. And I'll be the moderator for the first trade panelist today. We're going to be talking about not only trade, but also manufacturing. And I'd like to introduce to you our panelist, Mark Corr. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer for Vermeer Corporation. Mark. Jim Field. Jim is the President of Agriculture Division for John Deere. Jim, thanks for being with us.
Jim, thanks for coming.
Fred Gorrell. In the U.S., we would consider him an undersecretary. In Canada, he's the Assistant Deputy Minister of Ag Canada. Thanks for being here, Jim.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Pleasure. And Randy Spronk, past President of the National Pork Producers Council.
Randy, thanks for coming.
So we're going to offer a couple of minutes for each of them to share their thoughts and give the elevator speech on an opening statement. So first off, Mark, why don't you go ahead, just a couple of minutes on your opening comments.
He said just a couple of minutes a couple of times. I think that's what it means. So Mark Corr, as he'd mentioned, I'm from Pleasantville, Iowa, and grew up there. We're still involved in next year will be a century farm that my family is involved in and live there. Work for Vermeer Corporation, a neat story, a family-held company. Manufacturer of agriculture and construction equipment located in Pella, Iowa. So we have nearly 3,000 employees there. About a third of them depend on exports. So there's 1,000 people that leave our facilities every evening after their shift and go back to their small communities around Pella that are heavily dependent on our ability to reach the global markets. So we primarily focus on the hay and forage side of agriculture. And then if you've used the internet or energy or water sometime today, we were probably involved in that to some degree with the innovations that have come out of Pella. So certainly opportunity to be here and certainly welcome that and appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim?
So I'm Jim Field, and as was stated, I'm with John Deere, and I've been with Deere for about 23 years. Maybe I'll offer some comments building on some of the comments that have already been made about this event and how important particularly trade is. And before I do that, though, let me thank the organizers, Bruce, for putting this event together. I think this is absolutely vital to get out and talk about these important issues. And when you think about trade, and you think about our propensity, or our need, rather, as a society to feed the world in 2050. We're all very, very familiar with the notion that we're going to have to double the amount of agricultural output, or over sort of the period 2010 to 2050, we're going to have to basically produce more agricultural output than we did almost since the inception of time. I think one thing that's not perhaps as clearly recognized by folks is today about 15 or 16% of the world population relies on trade to solve their food needs. By 2050, that's estimated to be north of 50%. So this concept and this of why trade is important, we all understand why it's so important from our sort of farm perspective and from our involvement in the agricultural perspective. But from a higher level, it's important to the security of this world going forward. And that's why I think trade is such a vitally important topic to talk about at a summit such as this. And so I look forward to the opportunity to have this interaction today. And again, I want to thank the organizers and all the dignitaries who took time to be here from their very, very hectic schedule, which I think shows their commitment to ag. Thank you.
Thank you. Fred?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm your northern neighbor, and I've had a time I spent at the Canadian Embassy. I've traveled through the United States, and I think it's a very exciting time for agriculture. And before I start, I wanted to recognize Canada's Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture, Jean-Claude Poisson, He is here today because of the importance of the event. And I would just point out that Mr. Poisson, he's a fourth generation dairy and grain farmer. His sons are running the operation. He knows the product well. So that's who we have in our agriculture. And he's here because of the importance of this event to Canada as well as yourself. I'd also just like to say that the relationship between Canada and the United States is strong on agriculture. We have a very balanced, strongly integrated industries. Last year, there was about $47 billion US of agricultural products traveled across our borders. That's about 1.4, that includes $1.4 billion from Iowa. I think we're your third best customer. I think you've got Mexico, Japan, and Canada. But the key point is we're a very key partner. And not only do we trade with each other, we build things together. It's called Salford Farm Machinery. It's from Ontario. It actually has an office, manufacturing office here in, I think if I pronounce it right, Osceola. And what they do is they hire a couple of dozen people here, the subcontractors, and a lot of that machinery ends up back in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So it's really a good indication. Canadian firms hire Iowans, and that integration actually it's growing our economies, it's strengthening our rural economies, and quite frankly, it's on a regional basis. When we look at the bigger picture from a North American point of view, I heard Senator Grassley make reference to the NAFTA discussions. Something that's going on is because we're pretty much the envy of the world. I heard him say do no harm relative to NAFTA. That would be a comment that Canada would also take on. But the idea, Canada, the United States and Mexico together, we represent approximately between 17 and 18% of all the food that is exported globally. The United States is 15% or 12% of that by itself. So what we're doing, and to my colleagues' comments, there is an opportunity. We are a platform on food security, social stability around the world, and we're one of the few countries and areas in the world that actually can be able to produce food, primary and value-added products for the world. So for me, that's a very exciting opportunity. It's a message that I like to deliver and to be part of. And all I can say is I think we have a really good panel. I'm very excited to be here, and I hope it's very engaging. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Randy?
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. I take it I'm the token dirt under his fingernail farmer on the panel here this morning, so thank you for that opportunity. You know, I think my career is exemplifying the success of trade. In other words, when I started my career in the 80s, you know, we were a net importer of pork. And through the free trade agreements that have been negotiated to now, we actually export over 26% of our product that's raised in the United States. And so, you know, I'm actually a farmer. I mean, I planted just under 4,000 acres of corn and soybeans this spring. Spronk Brothers will market about 230,000 market hogs this coming year. And I think trade has been so important to my career. And actually, as we bring in the next generation to my farming operation, it's one of the things we are so productive. And we know that we need to have the ability to trade and to move our exports out of this country. When 97% of the population growth is going to occur outside of the United States, you know, we need to realize that, and we are so productive in the Midwest here that in order to be able to continue to grow, to be productive, we need to have access to those markets. And I think from my standpoint, I think really the bullet point that's the take home today is of the 20 free trade agreements that we have negotiated so far today, we export more product to those 20 countries than we do to the rest of the world combined, which is 150 countries. And so I think the success just of those free trade agreements in my industry has been very beneficial, and we actually want to see continued growth with that.
We're going to start with Fred offering up. I know you heard from Senator Chuck Grassley a moment ago about the update on NAFTA, but Fred, if you could offer anything more from your Canadian point of view for the crowd, just to kind of give you somewhat of a framework or timeline of where the whole NAFTA trade issue is.
I told them they could ask me any questions, so you can tell they're starting off well, so that's okay. But to put it in a nutshell, the first round of the negotiations are going to be on August 16th. They're going to be in Washington. The Mexicans, Canadians, and the Americans are going to be there. They're going to start looking at really what is the discussion, what is the text, and that will be progressing over a number of months. And very much, I think from our point of view, the modernization, the updating of NAFTA is something everybody recognizes. This trade agreement, you know, it's 20 some odd years old. It needs to be updated. And I think it is an opportunity this is my personal opinion, it'd be an opportunity for the three countries to demonstrate to the world just how well we can do things together.
Okay. Randy, maybe the first question to you. Could you describe a bilateral agreement that you would support, and are these types of agreements better for U.S. farmers?
You know, that's really the number one offensive one that we'd have here right now would be with Japan. Japan's our number one export country in the world. We've had a long-standing relationship. It's the number one in value that we export to them. With the withdrawal from Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership Agreement, you know, we've got other countries that have come in to Japan here and actually tried to take away some of our market share that we've had there. They've got free trade agreements with them, and so we're very concerned. The EU just has inked a free trade agreement with Japan. They literally took verbatim, you know, our language from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership and used it into theirs, and so Japan's a $2 billion a year customer for us. We had anticipated with TPP it'd be another $2 billion, and so now with us being out of that, other countries are having those bilateral free trade agreements. That's our number one offensive is we'd like to see a bilateral trade agreement with Japan.
Anybody else like to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, you know, bilateral or multilateral, bilaterals, you know, we're good with both, and certainly our non-protectionism in our thought process at Vermeer. Bilaterals, to some degree, can be difficult for a company to manage the differences in all of those 20 or 25 or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, it just needs to happen and happen soon.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, you know, the notion, first of all, any agreement is good. But, you know, clearly a preference to a multilateral, just from the administrative burden and the complexity of administration of, you know, just sort of an array of bilateral agreements. Multilaterals are clearly preferable, but at the end of the day, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and if we have to, if bilaterals work, they work, and so there's that trade-off.
How important is China to U.S. ag exports? A lot of folks might think, well, that's a pretty simple question. It might be a simple answer to it, but how does the U.S. walk this fine line between, you know, ticking them off too much with them being such a large customer of the U.S.? Maybe you could weigh in, Randy, first off on with the pork situation.
You know, China, I think everybody can see just because of the population and the population growth that's expected from China, you know, it's going to be our highest potential customer as we look forward here. Obviously, there's some hindrances with beta antagonists and ractopamine free that, you know, we need to encounter, but, you know, we see that as where we have the most potential, and so that's why I was just there in April, you know, looking on farms, and I really believe for my Gen 2 that's being here, we actually pulled ractopamine out of our rations so that we could export along with our packer and exporter friends to be able to get that access to that market, and so it's very important to us here as we see that growth coming forward here. I fully believe they're going to continue to import and continue to import more of our product.
Manufacturing-wise, can you speak?
Yeah, interesting. We're having some real nice success, and I would say fun and fulfillment of selling a lot of balers for biomass industry and energy production within China. And so from our perspective, it's working pretty well. The intellectual property protection is just miserable, I think, for all of us in the agricultural equipment innovation space is how do you participate, how do you support that economy, how do you create jobs here by effective export, but yet manage your intellectual property so that it's worth the investment. And I think all of us in the ag equipment manufacturing space have been challenged by that. We want China to be successful. We want to export there. We want the people there to enjoy the things in life that they deserve. But trying to balance that with the investment strategy and long-term risk is a difficult decision about just to what degree do you invest there. How long can you be competitive exporting with the things that you've developed and innovated?
How does John Deere weigh in, Jim?
So, you know, I mean, I think we first start thinking about this from the end users of our products, and China is important, clearly important from our end user, our farmer customers' perspective. I mean, if you look at the top 3 export markets for the producers here sitting in the room today, It's basically Canada, China, and Mexico. And we spent a little bit of time talking about how we're going to deal with the Canadian and Mexican issue with NAFTA. The focus on China is also vitally important. I think it's also important as we think about China, and maybe we heed a little bit of Senator Grassley's advice, whether you want to call it do unto others or living in the glass house. For every reaction, there's a counter reaction, and so we need to look at these relationships. Every country needs to look at these relationships in a holistic manner, because I think it's very easy for one particular sector to get lathered up about how do they deal with that particular sector, and it could be something that doesn't have anything to do with ag, but has all kinds of implications on ag. And so that's why it's really important, I think, that these relationships be looked at from a very, very holistic perspective. But clearly, to the producers in this room, China will be an important segment that we'll need to continue to participate in. If you look at the U.S. and you say there's about 325 million acres of stable cropland, and you project forward what is going to be sort of the productivity enhancements and improvements that we would suggest we should see over the next 40 years, and then you project forward what's going to happen with domestic consumption here in the U.S. Export has got to be part of the game, because we're going to overproduce, and again, it gets back to this whole this whole world food security issue, so on and so forth. But I think that's why it's so vitally important that we take these and we look at them in a holistic basis. And China is one example of where we need to do that.
Go ahead.
I would add, like for us, China is our second largest market. We put our canola, that's our major crop there, but we have pork, we've got beef. China consumes 40% of the global pork. 4 out of 10 pigs is consumed in China. I heard your comment, and because of the importance that our industry on their own, supported by the government, came up with a ractopamine-free program to be able to make sure we go there, because we have problems sometimes there. So that, and at the same time as Canada, like the United States, just to share with you, looking forward, we have to export 50% of everything we produce from an agricultural point of view. We're 35 million people. So we have exports for us is our life. I think in the United States it's 20 to 30%. It's the same thing. We all have to export. And when we look at it, I heard we have an agreement. I get to be a little bit of a bragging here in a nice way. We just have an agreement with the EU. So we now have a free trade agreement with the EU. That's something that we're looking for. But one of the problems and one of the challenges is the bilateral agreements are good for the one country. You made reference to another country having access to China or Japan that we don't. So it's getting a rather complex world. And I understand about manufacturing. You've got different requirements for different countries. We can make errors and mistakes when we do that too. So I think working together, that's part of my message, is the working together and taking a coordinated approach and trying to level the playing field is something that we should all be doing together.
So one of the things, Mike, that struck me as hearing the discussion, and we think about the holistic approach. So last summer or last spring, China arbitrarily put a 35% tariff on DDGs. Doesn't affect pigs, but certainly affected ethanol producers and farmers on the value of their product. How does one think about those agreements when that happens, so it doesn't affect manufacturing, doesn't affect pork, but clearly affects agriculture in general? How should we think about that or deal with that?
I think you directed it towards you. I'll follow up.
That's the heart of the whole issue as we come to trade. And then when somebody has a good agreement and somebody else needs to have a resolution, how do you prevent the other one from getting sideswiped because of the issue? And I think that becomes the open dialogue that we need to have each and every day. From my standpoint, I'm one of the best customers of DDGs there is. We're taking our rations from 20% up to 45% here for fourth quarter. And so that actually was beneficial to me, because there again, it's a market-based deal and it made a difference to me. And so, from my standpoint, I really would like to have access for the pork that we can sell over there, and that's where we see our most potential. But there again, I don't have the the answer to that one here today, but I do know that that's the difficulty of the trade agreements, whether they're bilateral or multilateral.
I assume we'd ask Governor Branstad just to fix it. But yeah, I think those things are difficult, and you know, from a simplistic perspective, it's about communication and collaboration. And I know it's not that simple, but I do believe we talk about this a lot at Vermeer. When we purchase from vendors in just a normal commerce, we have to be a good customer. It's not about constantly working and believing that the money's only flowing one way, and so we get to be in control. And I believe in that holistic look as we try to work well with such critical countries like China. We have to understand how we can be a good customer as well, and that means a lot of things, you know, from a quality perspective, communication, delivery, understanding their side of the story as well. But I mean, Bruce, that's a great question, and obviously there's those little, we fight it with little bits and pieces of steel imports and those kinds of things. But you know, I talk about Governor Branstad. I think an unbelievably good move by our president, that it takes some sort of trust that has to be built up over time, and decisions that are quicker than where we're at today, but are based on good solid knowledge from multiple industries.
The next question is about the other elephant in the room, and that's Mexico. We hear a lot about how the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico didn't start out so well at the beginning of the Trump administration. But the question to you, and I'd like to hear from all of you, is the sky really falling with Mexico?
Go ahead.
I can start off with Mexico, and so first you got to paraphrase it and set the stage. Mexico is our #1 volume export. Through my leadership in the National Pork Producers Council, we biannually had a trilateral between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It's NAFTA, I mean, and very important. We openly discuss dialogue, you know, back and forth, the issues from trucking to try and help resolve from, you know, imports of live pork back into the United States. And so NAFTA and Mexico are very important to us. I mean, and so when it really comes down to it, it's do no harm, as was stated here earlier. It's very important from our standpoint that we continue to have that trade with Mexico. Matter of fact, you add Mexico and Canada together. Mexico is #2, Canada's #4. Those two countries that are part of NAFTA, that's 1/3 of our exports.
So from my perspective, I would say the answer is no. The sky is not falling. You know, recently, I think it was even last week or within the last week, I heard some comments that were published that Secretary Perdue had made on some of his discussions with Mexico, and indications that gave very, very clear indications that the notion that the sky would be falling would be a gross over-dramatization of the issue. You know, I think as we said earlier, we're in the early stages. The framework for negotiations for NAFTA have been issued, and I think that would probably be incorrect in message to have folks resonate with this, that the sky has fallen in Mexico.
I'll even jump farther out. I don't agree with the premise right at the start. I've had the privilege, Secretary Perdue recently invited Minister McCauley, my minister, and Secretary Calzada down in Savannah. They have good relationships. The Secretary Perdue has gone to Mexico. We have more trade. We're the envy of the world for how we do trade. Yes, there's problems. When you have a relationship as big and complex and integrated as we do in North America, and we look at Mexico, that's our one of our #2 export markets as well. There's always going to be problems. How we deal with them is important, because all I can say is people outside of North America would be very happy to see us not be successful from our point of view. I hope we all remember that. But I look at the Mexican dynamic. We have a great trade relationship with them. You're sort of you're the meat in the sandwich in the NAFTA. And by the way, that could be Canadian or American wheat that makes that bread. Yes, but
likewise with the pork.
Exactly. And we might as well go beef. We're doing that. Okay. But the key thing is on the relationship. I think I really would like to stress the point from my perspective. The glass is always half full, And I'm looking for the excitement and the opportunities going forward that we've talked about. So that would be my thoughts.
Well said.
So one of the additional questions, and maybe to stay on the trade issue, because I think for the audience and for all of us that are involved, in particular thinking about Vermeer and John Deere and trade with Brazil. On one hand, we have a country that's a large competitor in production and sometimes thought of as a complement to the U.S. because of the hemisphere. But obviously is a large intellectual technology trade partner for the U.S., but has tariffs on imports of U.S. manufacturing products to the tune of 42%. Certain things can be manufactured there. Other smaller companies in the U.S. are challenged to be able to ship products to Brazil because of the 42% tariff. How do, in particular, Vermeer, John Deere deal with that on some tractors being built there? The one in the corner probably is built here. How does one try and understand that within the realm of the other aspects of Brazilian beef coming to the U.S. tariff-free, and yet there's a 42% tariff on John Deere tractors going to Brazil?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's difficult. We've invested quite a bit in an effort to enjoy some success in the Brazilian agricultural market, as you and I have talked about before, Bruce, both in the biomass energy side as well as where we think they're probably heading within cattle production. And so we haven't established manufacturing down there. We are a rounding error to the gentleman to my left in terms of size, so that's more difficult for us. But when suddenly the same piece of equipment, a hay baler, to a customer down there is 3 times as much as it is here, it becomes extremely difficult for us to be successful. We love the people there. We do believe it's a compliment from an agricultural perspective, but we've actually pulled back our investment, not totally out of that marketplace, but you've either got to be there and manufacture there to be successful from my perspective, or just you've got to have an innovation that is unbelievable to be able to stand those tariffs. And so I think that is one of those that's extremely difficult because, again, we would like to participate in that market. We believe our innovation can do big things for them. But we've got less people working in Pella based on our inability to manage through that tariff than we did 2 or 3 years ago. But to think about what's coming this way, to your point, in terms of beef imports, that no doubt, that one doesn't feel fair. I sometimes, as I travel that area, I think, why are they doing this? Because the country's not in good shape. And so how do you get your methodology around the kind of protectionism that they have, but yet economy and governmental struggles that are so significant? That eventually that will align better with how we would like to do business in more of an agreement perspective where there's give and take and there's good opportunity. But it is just hard to fathom that there's that much stack up in terms of tariffs heading that direction and the limitations it puts on those folks trying to be successful. In our perspective, anywhere, whether it's in telecommunications and fiber installation and water installation, or if it's an agricultural side, it is a very difficult one.
So, first of all, let me just frame it by kind of sharing with you the scope of our business in Brazil. We're down in Brazil with our agricultural products and with our construction and forestry products, and we've been in Brazil for many years, for more than a couple of decades. And I offer that because we have kind of the whole spectrum of approaches to the market. We have products that we bring in directly out of the U.S. We have products that we bring out of Mexico into Brazil, and we have some pretty significant local manufacturing operations. And you probably weren't aware of this, Bruce, but actually this 8R here, we do now produce in Brazil. Just over the last year, we launched production of that. So we've got the whole spectrum. And you are, of course, correct that, basically the tariffs range from next to nil on some products all the way on up 35, and I think even in some categories that we're in probably not involved and even get north of the numbers you referenced as well. So they're pretty steep. I think, though, when you look at this tariff situation, I think also what's really important, too, is that we don't limit the discussion just to tariffs, because tariffs tend to be the most transparent of the trade barriers that we face around the world. And I'm just making this comment not only relative to Brazil, but just across the whole spectrum. Perhaps as difficult to deal with is kind of the non-tariff-based barrier. So, access to financing, regulatory requirements. You got into it a little bit, and when you talked about protection of intellectual property, administrative burdens, all of those sorts of things. And I think it would be less than I'd be probably disingenuous if I said, when we decided to set up certain manufacturing operations, that the amount of tariffs coming inbound were not part of the consideration. Absolutely, they were. But it's also, from our perspective, you think about a tractor that size and the logistics involved in trying to get a tractor that size into that marketplace and the deal with the suppliers into a marketplace that's incredibly volatile. There was a number of other considerations that we went through, because that tractor was not localized until just a year ago, despite the fact that we've been selling that 8R basically in Brazil since inception and dealing with the other economic realities of it. But I think with that preamble, I think the answer to your question is, from my perspective, is this is why we need to continue to work on things and blow oxygen on things like the WTO to get after the whole spectrum of these barriers to free trade, because free trade is so absolutely vitally important to every one of us sitting in the room, every one of us listening on this live stream, so on and so forth. And it's not only the ag sector, it's the second and third order effects that the governor and the senator pointed to that are so important to this broad economy. That it's about 11% of GDP. If you look at kind of the second and third order effects of what happens in the United States from agriculture, and it's huge, and trade has got to be part of that solution. So I don't have a great answer to your question, Bruce, but I appreciate it. And we'll keep working on a better answer even.
Would like to ask about the world export market share. So currently the U.S. has 15% of the world export market share. That's down from 28% in 2010, 2011 marketing year. So how does the U.S. get ag commodities to other countries in a better form, especially commodities like wheat? And the second part of the question is, could corn exports be the next commodity to see world demand decrease?
It's always interesting to look at the Canadian to speak on the U.S. market, so I don't think...
Well, it's always good to get an outside-in perspective.
Okay. I'll give you just a general comment on commodities. We've talked about the world population. By 2050, if it's going to be 8 billion, 9 billion. Huge demands, huge opportunity. We want to be, and I say we, I'll talk about us as a group, we want to be part of the solution to help feed the world, make sure there is a good quality, nutritious food for everybody. I think the demand's going to be there. It's the pull. I think what we talked about, tariffs, they're transparent. We understand them. Most people can work around them in a business way and then work forward. The non-tariff barriers, there's things that are changing in the world, how people produce food. We talked about ractopamine-free. We talk about organic. You talk about GMO. There's a whole explosion of different types of factors and attributes that consumers want depending on the market. But the vast majority of the world, and 95% of the consumers, as you said, are outside of our North America. I know you say United States, but I'll include myself with Canada and Mexico if I could in this context. Just, they're going to need our product. We're one of the few areas in the world that's stable. We have rules of law. We know how to produce it. We're producing products, grains, meats, proteins better than anybody else in the world. So for me, it's how do we take care of all that other stuff that we're talking about? Because the demand will be there, and it's how are we positioning ourselves to make sure that we can maximize it for our producers and farmers. So
Specifically, though, for the U.S., the corn industry especially, we were always the largest corn store in the world. And now that's not necessarily the truth anymore. Soybeans, the same thing with soybeans. We were always, you know, one of the main suppliers of soybeans. Now for soybeans, South America is going to overtake our production. For corn, we have a lot of other producers of corn around the world. So specifically, what do you think the U.S. can do to not let that market share continue to slip away?
So I'll give you the answer from my perspective is, you know, I think there's two issues, and one we've talked about a lot today, which is access and level playing fields around the world. But the second issue, and I don't think it should be lost on us, is competitiveness. And I have no doubt that as we have this data-enabled agricultural revolution, the U.S. farmer will continue to be extremely, extremely competitive. But there's a lot of costs that occur from I like to say, from the farm gate to the Golden Gate, from the farm gate to the port. And if you think about places like the Black Sea region, you think about what they're doing in Latin America, they're investing in infrastructure that's going to make their delivery of those grains to the port become ever increasingly more efficient. We're not, or it sure doesn't appear like we're in that same mode here in the United States. And so I think we really, part of the answer is, okay, we've got to address the access, the level playing field, all those sorts of things. But then, from the United States perspective, we need to look inward and saying, what do we need to do to make sure that we maintain competitiveness? Part of it is, what are we going to do in terms of advanced agricultural practices? Are we going to be on the forefront of data-enabled agriculture? Those sorts of things. Then, but there's a big part of it also that happens once it leaves that farm gate. And that's the piece of it I think I see other parts of the world investing in much more aggressively than we are in the United States.
Yeah, and I think, and this maybe is more specific to the challenges that we have as a manufacturer, but just everything that's involved around regulation and other things that's going to keep us from being as much of a low-cost producer of a commodity as what we need to be. This number blows me away, but from the National Association of Manufacturers, they talk about that the average manufacturer has about $19,000 per employee in regulation and compliance. And no longer in companies do you have like environmental engineers, you have compliance managers. And so that tells you what we fight. We're just one little part of the value stream for sure. But the cost of these tractors sitting here that many of you depend on so much in Tier 4 emissions and other regulations that have been put upon us, somebody's going to pay for that. Neither one of us are not-for-profit organizations, and so those costs to some degree are passed on. And I think those same regulations are the people, you know, providing you chemicals and providing you hybrids and those kinds of scenarios. You know, we're producing commodities, and we like to think that they're high quality for sure, and we like to be able to perhaps differentiate them with organics or whatever it may be. But the reality is, a part of that level playing field, this country, or these two countries, we have to be given the opportunity to be as efficient and low cost in our production as possible. That, to me, is just as critical as the tariffs and the other dynamics that we're talking about. People need to eat. Low cost will be a significant portion of that. And so I see that one as pretty significant as terms of just our ability throughout the whole value stream to be able to keep cost as balanced and as minimized as we can. You know, I think the other challenge is going to be, and I see it every day now, we're in this little pocket of extreme drought southeast of here where I live, and I'm so amazed by how good these crops look. And that's exciting, but that also means that those hybrids have been developed to fit other areas of the world better than they were just 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think we have to have a sense of reality that there's going to be a greater amount of acres around the world that can be more productive by the great things that have happened within kind of the in the bag scenario. But I think we cannot lose sight from a governmental pressure perspective of what regulation and just kind of those things that confine all of us in this room from, at the end of the day, being the highest volume, lowest cost producer in the world.
I think that's extremely well said. I mean, and I like to summarize it like, at the end of the day, we're not going to change the laws of comparative advantage. If we conquer the access piece of it, we're not going to change those. And so, in your comment on the regulatory burden on businesses, on producers, on those sorts of things, those are costs that have to be borne by the market, and if it knocks us out of the park in terms of competitiveness, that creates a big issue for the long-term viability and sustainability of our businesses collectively as we know them today.
I want to turn our attention to the pork industry. It appears anyway, Randy, that we could be headed for a pork wall, so to speak. We are opening up 5 pork plants in the U.S. this year or the beginning of next year, and we haven't opened but 2 plants in the last couple of decades. What is the pork industry's approach to making sure that we don't have a lot of pork backed up and hog prices go to wherever, $2 or less?
I think some of it's just some of the discussion that was had earlier here is the potential that we see, for our industry and the success that we've had. You talk of being the low-cost producer. I mean, I'm on the executive committee of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, and so we deal with a lot of how competitive are we worldwide. It was Dr. Dermot Hayes from the great Iowa State University. We just usually were, top 3 or 4, but we're actually number 1. We've actually overcome Brazil as the most competitive producer in pork in the world. And when you start getting investment in infrastructure in plants like that, somebody's not doing that without seeing potential. And I'd say, the discussion was earlier about exporting corn. To me, one of the great things, and I think the success story from animal agriculture would have, is what it does for rural Minnesota and rural Iowa and rural South Dakota when we have that evaluated. Because when that plant's there, that's the ability to export that product there, but also from my standpoint, I mean, I'm buying U.S. soybean meal, I'm buying DDGs from a local ethanol plant. If that soybean meal plant is over in China, they can flip it over to Brazil, they can flip it to the market here. So when the infrastructure for exporting those products is within the Corn Belt here, I think that's what gives us a great success story here. And so, yes, there's some hurdles, and that's why I think we're being very defensive and do no harm to NAFTA, because even though Canada is exporting rect dopamine-free to China, we're actually backfilling some of that product back. I mean, our growth for exports has been up in Canada.
Yeah.
And so there's a great regional, from us, from the animal agricultural standpoint, specifically pork. I agree with you. We have never had an investment like we've had here with Company Guard, but I think part of it is just being efficient in manufacturing. I mean, there's updating plants. We hadn't have some plants, and there's great differences in cut costs when you've got an inefficient plant. You get a modern plant and the ability, its numerators over denominators, to be able to lower your cost for that export market, it makes a huge difference. And so we're optimistic. Our glass is half full, and we can see potential, and that's why we are very concerned about free trade agreements and keeping markets open, as has been discussed here earlier, because we do think there's so much potential.
Do you want to talk about the labor issues that are going to come with those 5 or those that the industry will have to face with the new packing plants?
Well, I think it's all the way over. It's not only from the packing plants, it's from the trucking industry, it's from me finding a driver on my feed truck. I mean, that is to find qualified employees. It's very difficult. I mean, when we want to grow our business, you need that capable opportunity. And so, yeah, that's very important for us, and that's one of our highest hurdles in one of these plants, and even on my farm when I come back to my own operation.
Mm-hmm. And what is the pork industry doing to shape or reshape the immigration laws for this country?
you know, it's an industry that's been on the forefront all along. I mean, I've been sideswiped by immigration coming into a packing plant, and when we've got trucks lined up to unload and the plant shut down. I mean, so to us, it's better to have the discussion early on. I mean, let's be very open and forefront, you know, on our immigration process and what's going on here, because these plants do need, and I think we should have the individuals that are in manufacturing, you know, explain that, have that reality that comes each and every day of needing employees to be able to show up every day when you're in a manufacturing process.
And recently, the NPPC had sent a letter to the administration about the steel and aluminum tariffs. How does that work back towards what pork producers are concerned about?
It kind of comes again to do no harm. In other words, what we're making reference to is there is from GATT from 1994 General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. There's a Section 232 that they can declare steel and aluminum as sensitive to our country. And there again, we're very worried. If you look at the countries that we export pork to, those are the same countries that we import steel from. And so there again, having the discussion beforehand, let's be very open and forthright, because we don't want to have tariffs and duties placed on our product to go to the same countries that are our top of our exports of where we bring our product to.
Mark, you had mentioned that the manufacturing industry faces some issues, labor, maybe some regulation. Mm-hmm. What other issues will you face going forward as far as manufacturing?
Yeah, for certain. I think we talked enough about regulation. This human capital thing is a big, big deal. We can have a group of contractors or farmers at our place or dealers, and we'll give them a list of things to vote on about what their biggest challenge or concern is moving forward. And it's not legislative or governmental issues or general economy. It's about getting enough qualified human capital to do the work. And so, yeah, in manufacturing, it's a challenge. We've been able, even in Little Pella, Iowa, we've been able to keep our facilities vibrant with employees, but it gets a little more difficult every time. As an OEM of farm equipment, we're really, really worried about who's going to work in the dealerships. I just had a conversation with a Deere territory manager that covers southeast Iowa, and it's not just in more remote areas in Iowa. I really worry about in parts of Iowa 10, 20, 30 years from now, how we're going to support the farmer from an equipment service and support perspective. And this is radical, and I said it to the state ag teachers 2 or 3 weeks ago when I spoke to them about career readiness, that I could envision that if we don't do the right things to keep educational systems and schools vibrant in extreme southern Iowa, if we don't keep hospitals where they need to be, if we don't provide internet capability and speed, that we may be shipping workers to southern Iowa to do agriculture 30 years from now, just like they do the mines in Western Australia. I think that's very real, because today, if it's already happening that our dealers can't get enough service technicians to support these tractors and our balers and those kinds of things, that's a real deal. And so we're spending quite a bit of effort at Vermeer. Mary Anderga, former educator and the chairman of our company, has been very involved with STEM, with you, Governor Reynolds, and many others. And we're starting actually at ages 3 through 5 at our daycare. It's not really a daycare, it's a Yellow Iron Academy. That's where they start learning about STEM type activities. And we take that all the way through the school systems and then how we bring people into our company. But yeah, I would say that, yeah, this is a lot about export and low cost and those kinds of things. But the estimate of 3 million jobs needed in manufacturing over the next 5 years, and 2 million of those perhaps won't be filled. That's a real issue. And I think we're closer today than we were 5 years ago in terms of encouraging good young people to take the career path to work with their hands. And truthfully, it's one of the things that I liked about during the campaign. Senator Rubio talked quite often that a young person could graduate from high school with a trade certificate. There's no reason why they couldn't have that in their hand. If they do that, there's no way that, maybe this is controversial, but there's no way that many of the liberal arts type high-priced degrees are ever going to catch up with them financially, and they're going to be able to enjoy a really nice career within a manufacturer, within a Vermeer dealership, a John Deere dealership, whatever it may be. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges in manufacturing for sure, and maybe it's just because it's a passion thing of mine, but the human capital component to be able to do the work moving forward. It has got to be on all of our radar screens, and we've got to be very supportive and directed on how to improve that.
Anything to add, Jim?
No, I think that's right on. I think particularly the comments on STEM, that's certainly been a focus of ours. I would call out the Governor and Governor Branstad as well in terms of the collaborative relationship that we've had in trying to promote STEM. And I would cite most of the same statistics in terms of the void that we're looking at in the manufacturing sectors. And I think today, you know, if you actually looked at it, there's probably about 350,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector that are unfilled as of today because of lack of the requisite human capital, and that will grow. So it's a big issue.
The rural broadband thing, when people talk about that, I think they think about Cherry County, Nebraska, or somewhere that's very remote. I live 35 miles southeast of here. We cannot stream at home. And so I would say we're in a pretty populated area relative to the whole agricultural economy. And luckily, my girls really don't know what Netflix is because we don't have that capability as many different ways as we've tried. So, you know, there's just, as we talk about infrastructure as well, I think it's interesting. We talk about roadways and waterways and those kinds of things, but it's also water infrastructure, it's broadband infrastructure, it's energy infrastructure. There's a lot of other elements for us to be competitive as a global player. And to keep agriculture in the top where we need to be, that's in that whole kind of infrastructure discussion that I assume someday after Obamacare will be talked about.
I want to go back to trade, and one of the biggest issues with trade, you guys hit upon it a little bit, but it has to do with some of the regulations. But and I wish we had Governor Reynolds mic'd here for this question, but maybe she talked about this when she went to China recently. What can be done? What would you like to see get done as far as the U.S. with the U.S. trading partners to address or change the procedures for registering and gaining certification for imports, and also reworking the unscientific sanitary and phytosanitary rules?
Somebody smarter than me.
You know, I think that is one of the things, if you look at opening up NAFTA, I mean, that's one of the areas, the SPF rules, yes, the book needs to be updated. And so I think there are some of those things. You're really down into the nitty gritty, you know, of trade with other countries when you get into the SPF rule book here. And so, you know, from just a broad perspective, yes, they need to be updated because there again, some of those are, you know, it's not a tariff or it's not a duty, but somebody's saying, you know, what you can use for wash in a packing plant is approved and, you know, yours is not. And so, you know, they are part of it. Sometimes that ends up being a non-trade barrier, and so those things we need to be cognizant of as we discuss these free trade agreements, because it can be inhibiting when we finally get down to the nitty-gritty. In other words, what temperatures does a product have to be held at, and just all the functional rules of, you know, when this product is moving across another border.
Fred, how does Canada handle this with, let's say, China?
It's complex, to be honest. Having predictable rules is the goal. We talked about the bilateral trade agreements people have. There's a reason why we have them. It's because the WTO and the multilateral system didn't get us where we collectively wanted globally. So there's all these free trade agreements. And some countries use that to their advantage. They might use Canada against the United States against Canada, or stuff like that, or the EU, and how we do it. And what they'll do is they'll set different rules sometimes for different countries, or how they interpret them. When rules are written, when they're somewhat ambiguous, there's usually a reason why they're written in an ambiguous reason, because it gives people flexibility. Now, at the end of the day, clarity, but what I've learned, for example, with China or other countries, there are cultural issues, there are language issues, and experiences. We're looking at North America. We have a long history of trade. China has just really joined the WTO since 2000, at that time, yes. So part of that is a learning process, and quite frankly, though, a number of the countries, and this is sort of half negative and half positive, so I'll get there quickly, but we don't have as much influence globally as we used to. Like we talked about the Brazils, we talked about India, China, other countries that really are able to have an economic and political influence in how the world is organized. So having a predictable, rules-based, we talk about science-based system that provides predictability, can be quantified, that is how Canada comes at it. Because if we don't have, we're a small country relatively politically, so we don't have perhaps some of the aspects that you have in this country. So if we don't have rules, and when we're working with China, we try to clarify it. But I have to say, it doesn't always work in the sense, and you have to do it again. And part of the frustration is, and I heard the language here in the questions, it's not fair. One thing I learned from my mother when I was young, life's not fair. And I don't mean that in a bad way, it's just so, but she said how you respond to that is really important. So what I've learned is, in Canada, we re-engage all the time and try to clarify. We work with the United States. We work with Australia and other like-minded countries to try to make sure that when we're dealing with China or another country, we're all talking the same language so that it is predictable and there's no one-offs. I guess that's sort of a long answer to a short question.
We may be down to the last question, but I'd like to just ask, have you all address, are you optimistic for the future of U.S. trade? And pick the product if you'd like, or the commodity.
Yeah, certainly. From Vermeer's perspective, from my love of agriculture and involvement from that side, we just have to get moving. I think the reality is the world's not going to wait for us to recalibrate or calibrate in general our views on how trade needs to happen. We have to make it work. We have to take something like NAFTA that we're big supporters of and realize that it may need refined, perhaps to be able to advance, to move forward for all the countries involved for that, to work. I think the reality is this country lives and breeds on competition. And I'm not much into participation ribbons, and I think that if we have a level play, that not even perfectly level, I don't believe it even has to be perfectly level for the entrepreneurship and the competitive spirit in this country, and that is very stable. And sometimes maybe it doesn't seem stable, but as many of you know, among everybody that we're talking about exporting to, we're much more stable than that. And so there's really no reason why we can't leverage the competitive spirit that we have and the resources and the capital that's available to anywhere close to a level playing field. And the reality is people want to eat better, and there's more of them.
Jim?
So I would say absolutely, I'm optimistic. And if we stick with the theme of the glass being half full, I think we can look back at the successes that we've had with NAFTA and use that as our energy to propel us forward as we reach out around the world and as the rest of the world reaches out to us in terms of trade agreements. There was some indication that maybe there'd be a question on the success of NAFTA. I mean, you can look at it from my perspective in a lot of different ways. But I think most of us would say that it's been a very, very successful endeavor for all the countries that have been involved in it. I think I'm even more optimistic today than I was yesterday because I'm here at this forum. And I think this forum is hopefully will energize us around getting out and telling the ag story and telling how important trade is to ag and how important ag is to the economy. And I think if we stand on the mountaintops and we yell that and with really, really sound, solid facts behind our story, which exist in mass, we will continue to propel forward on achieving more trade. And it's not at the end of the day, it's not about is it something we want to do. It's at the end of the day, as I started out at the beginning, it's something that we absolutely must do if we're going to have food security in 2050. So I'm all in, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Okay. Fred?
All in as well, and actually the government of Canada in their budget this year set a growth target of $75 billion for exports for Canada. Right now we're just over 60, and we're looking at that as agriculture is one of the primary drivers of the economy. We look at all the realities of the world of what we've talked about, but when we talk about growing our agricultural exports to $75 billion in 2025, it's inspirational to see where we're going, but it also means we're doing it with you. So we're very keen on that.
Randy?
I think you've heard from my prior discussion here that I'm an optimist. I mean, there's a reason why we're bringing in Gen 2. There's a reason why there's infrastructure going into mid-America here on processing and packing. And so, you know, I really believe that, you know, from a perspective of there, again, safe, affordable protein. I mean, let's come at it from beef, pork, and lamb, the U.S. Meat Export Federation. I mean, I'm competitive because of the manufacturing that we have in the United States. I'm competitive because of the corn and soybean guys that are in the audience here. I mean, that's one avenue, that's one venue that we can export those products. And so very much a positive standpoint of it. It's what really from my tenure as leadership in the National Pork Producers Council, it was about trade, it was about free trade agreements. Every time we see a free trade agreement come through, in other words, the last ones would have been Panama, Korea, and Colombia, South Korea and Colombia. You look at every one of those countries here from when that got initiated, we're bringing product into those countries. We start looking at Latin America. I mean, we kind of ignored a little bit here. We keep talking about Asia, but really there's growth potential in Latin America when you start coming into Panama and Colombia. And so I think that's where we try to be very optimistic. And even, you know, it's not just the number 1, 2, or number 3 countries within the world here. It's, you know, the ability to, you know, let's go from 20 countries to 50 countries that we're exporting our product to. And there again, that's why we are involved in trade. That's why we spend some of our own checkoff money to making sure that we have the research and we can go ahead and expand those markets.
Well, thanks very much to all of you for taking part. For 47 consecutive years, the U.S. has had a trade deficit, so it should be interesting to see how the future goes. But thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Bruce.
Appreciate it.
Great event as always.
Sir.
Thank you.
Given everything inside